Well, good morning in America and good afternoon in Europe. I'm Josh Lipsky, Director of Programs and Policy at the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economics Program. And we are so delighted this morning to co-host this event in partnership with Politico and welcome Sir Suma Chakrabarti, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Sir Suma is completing his second and final term as EBRD President after a remarkably successful tenure, and we're very honored he's with us today. As many of you know, he served at the highest levels of international development as well as the British civil service. And he has brought that experience to bear at the EBRD. In fact, right now, the EBRD is responding extraordinarily swiftly to the economic devastation caused by this pandemic. It's committed all its activity in 2020 and 2021 to combat COVID-19's economic impact. And in fact, Ryan and Sir Suma can bring this up in the discussion, I think that makes it the first and only financial institution, international financial institution, to be solely COVID focused. And we know that emerging and developing economies are going to be especially hard hit in this crisis. We've talked about that here at the Atlantic Council. Many of you were with us when the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, was here last month. And so we're so pleased to have this conversation now with Sir Suma. And the EBRD's €21 billion economic rescue package is so critical at this moment, and it's going to help heal the fractures in growth and investment between the advanced and the developing economies. Now, the Atlantic Council, we're committed to focusing on this issue, not just looking at the current crisis, but looking ahead, looking at what's coming in the global economy. And we're also looking at trying to be creative as we think through these issues. And I think the EBRD has really been at the forefront of that and a model for other institutions. So we're so pleased to have Sir Suma with us. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ryan Heath, Senior Editor at Politico. And by the way, the author of a great newsletter, Global Translations, we're all reading at the Atlantic Council. So if you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's a real pleasure to be here. Great to see you, Suma. We normally catch up on the mountain in Davos or somewhere like that, but it's good to catch up with you in a slightly different setting. Maybe to set the scene for those who don't know EBRD so well, you don't rescue governments the way the IMF does. You're financing private projects. But you're not exactly in a parallel universe to governments either. You're always connected into the political scene and the strategic direction of the countries that you're operating in. So to join that thought up with the $21 billion package you have around coronavirus, where are you looking to have impact with that? And how quickly can you get that money out the door?
Well, fundamentally, we're trying to have impact with private sector clients in particular. But also, as you mentioned, Ryan, I think we're also trying to help some of our state clients, state enterprises, municipalities as well. And I think it has 3 or 4, 5 channels maybe. One is essentially what we call a resilience framework. This is trying to provide liquidity for clients, existing clients, either directly or through the banking system, so they get through this crisis period and into the recovery phase. We're also looking at payment deferrals, restructurings for clients too. That's very, very important too. I think the third area would be trade finance. One of the biggest disruptions has been to the trading chains, if you like, the global value chains. And so trying to get as much trade finance into these economies has been very important, using the local banking system, of course. And in fact, in I think March and April, we had our 2 biggest months ever for trade finance going forward as well. We're creating some new frameworks as well for financial institutions and corporates. And I think the other channel to mention is what we call Vital Infrastructure Support Program. This is what one of my colleagues, I think, rather memorably called it at the board meeting, keeping the lights on. Mm-hmm. So obviously, as many infrastructure services become stressed, short of money, government budgets are under great pressure, we need to make sure that they have enough liquidity to get through it. Municipal services would be a classic example of this. All those services that people depend on at municipal level to make sure those services get through the crisis and into the recovery phase. So that 21 billion covers all of these areas and is everything, all our firepower for this year and next year. I actually hope, because we have enough capital capacity, that we can do even more than that. We won't have a shortage of resource problem. We just got to find enough good projects to do that.
Mhm. And is the 21 billion the total sum, or is that co-financed and leveraged with other parties?
That's the total of EBRD's own resources. So on top of that, we'd be mobilizing funding, you're quite right, from other players too, sometimes co-financing. So the total value of what we do will be much higher than that, depending on how much we can co-finance, syndicate with others as well.
Now, for most of our careers, 21 billion would have sounded like a huge figure or an unimaginable sum for most people in most organizations. And we're now in a world where globally trillions are being spent to try and deal with the effects of coronavirus. And when I went to add it all up, it seems like there's around about $1,000 in domestic spending for every $1 in global coordination and response. And I guess your bank falls somewhere in between, not domestic and not global at the same time. But I think that the point I'm trying to make is that it really feels like the whole is less than the sum of the parts at the moment when you look at the way all of that government money and other money is being mobilized. What should we do to rebalance that situation in your view?
So I think your analysis, in my view, is spot on. I think if you go back 5 years to the Addis conference, when we knew the 2030 agenda was coming, we'd had the financing for development agreement on that. We all knew what we had to do. We actually had to get more private sector finance into the system. I think, frankly, in the 5 years, only stuttering progress has been made on that anyway. Then along comes COVID-19, and actually, whatever numbers we had before, we need to redo them because the arithmetic has changed completely. And the amount of financing that's now required from public and private sources is a quantum much greater. So I personally think we need to go back to the drawing board internationally and take a new look, a fresh look at the quantity and quality of financing that we need for the next 10 years through 2030 and beyond, given the agenda we've now got and the recovery we now need to help these countries make as well. So I would call for a new Addis, if you like, to actually go back and think about the amounts. And actually that, of course, requires strong leadership from particularly the richer nations to come up with the plans, working with multilateral institutions like myself as well, because I think we have got to do much more. And that's why I say 21 billion for me is a sort of down payment. It's not the end of the story. It's got to be much more than that. And a lot of this money is going to have to come from private financiers as well, not just the state, because state budgets are under pressure. I think people will be worrying about budget deficits, although I think maybe the days of monetarist approach towards public spending, I think that's moving away from that actually. But I think what we've got to do is tap into sovereign wealth funds much better than we've been doing, pension funds and others, to really get the leverage, get the multiplier effect that we need into the system. And that's why I think we have to revisit the Addis agreement very soon, I think, in order to make headway quickly.
Yeah. And do you think that's something that can happen in isolation from some broader reassessment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? I don't hear too much chatter about it, but I do hear it out there now where some people just say.
So I think the goals are still highly relevant and the correct goals. I think they're the best description, I've always said, of all the development characteristics. The old Millennium Development Goals were good, but they described a subset of the total challenge. I think the SDGs, yes, there's lots of them, but they do describe the totality and the complexity of that challenge. So I don't think we need to revisit the goals. I hope we don't need to revisit the timeline either. But what we do need to revisit is the financing and the speed at which we do that. And that can only happen not just with the multilateral development banks and our leaderships, but I think with the major shareholders of these institutions and major governments, but also, again, the private sector out there, private sector finances need to be involved as well.
I think undoubtedly you are right on the speed there. But I'm going to take on the role of a watchdog for a second. And a watchdog would say that with lenders under pressure to pump out cash, authorities are going to be under a heightened risk of fraud, money laundering. How is your bank defending itself? And have you come across anyone trying to abuse the system so far?
So not so far, no. In fact, we have like all the multilaterals, we have extremely strong internal controls on compliance, integrity, and all those sorts of things. So that hasn't been the issue really. All our existing controls are still in play, and so I'm not seeing that as a problem much more. What I think is a bigger issue actually isn't the sort of fraud integrity issues. It's much more the disbursement issue.
Mhm.
So it's all very well for multilateral banks like mine to approve these sums and then sign the documents, have nice ceremonies. But actually, what really matters, what really transforms the economy, is the money reaching the client, whether it's in the private sector or the state sector. And that means hard work, I think, to get disbursements up much more. It's particularly in the private sector, we tend to do very well in terms of disbursement ratios. But if you look across the multilateral scene, you'll see disbursement ratios for sovereign clients are much more sticky. They're much slower because they quite often involve a lot more policy reform, policy conditionality. They involve legislatures as well. And that tends to slow down the whole process. We have got to crack that problem because, frankly, we can't sit around waiting for disbursements to take their time. We've got to get the money into these economies fast. So that is, for me, I think, the bigger problem at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And to make sure I understand that right, is that a case where governments or systems of governance where you're working, because you don't always work in countries that have the same standards of rule of law and transparency.
That's right.
You find yourself caught up sometimes by the messiness of that.
Yeah, so one of the big things I think in the last years that I've been president, we've really pushed on is this concept of trying to improve, first of all, the investment climate, but also the economic governance, so that these things do become better. So our private sector clients tell us a lot about how governments work with them, what needs improving. So we are impacted on things like procurement systems. These are quite technical things, but how can you get a procurement system to be faster, but also more objective and transparent? And so there's no graft involved at all. That's one of the biggest issues we work on as well. How can you create policy environments which then attract more private sector financing into a country? And I'm very fond of, and so I'll use this example again, the famous Benban solar park in Egypt, in Upper Egypt. It's going to end up as, I think already is, the largest solar park in Africa for sure. Bit of a debate whether it's the largest one in the world. But the great thing about that was we worked with the Egyptian government to get the regulatory environment right, and such that not just EBRD, although we're the lead financier, but all the other multilateral banks, private sector piled in because the regulatory environment, the investment climate, if you like, had improved so much. That work has to continue. It can't just get parked because of the COVID crisis. In fact, it probably makes it more urgent because we need the flows of finance to be faster even. So that has to continue for the future.
Mm-hmm. It's a good project to bring up because I wanted to pivot to some questions on the theme of leadership. And I wanted to start by asking whether you had any premonition when you started this job that you'd be running a green pandemic bank by the end of it. It feels like at one level a very cool shift, but also not what the history of your bank is at all.
So I think, when you start these jobs 8 years ago, and there are a number of things I wouldn't have predicted. I wouldn't have predicted what happened on Russia at that time, which was our biggest recipient country at the time. And I wouldn't have predicted, as you say, this pandemic at the time. What's important is whether a bank can respond rapidly in a resilient fashion to these challenges. And I think in both cases we've done that and we continue to do so. But it's also important not to lose sight during these response to crises, if you like, of the eternal issues that you've got to resolve in order to offer a brighter future. And you mentioned green. That's, for us at EBRD, we have made our reputation as being the green multilateral. Every multilateral, of course, is doing work in this area, but this has been the biggest part of EBRD's transformation since, I think, 2005-06, actually, when we first started. But we've taken it to new heights. Last year, 46% of our investments were in the green economy space. We're about to approve, hopefully within the next month, our new generation of green economy transition financing and strategy, and that will, I think, have even higher targets going forward. It's important in a crisis to make sure these sort of issues like green are captured in the projects you do. So it's not as if, because we're in a crisis, we should just park the green agenda. We have this approach called Tilt to Green. So within the solidarity package that is for this year and next year, we're trying to make sure even more of our projects actually are trying to do the right thing in terms of financing renewables, energy efficiency, all these sort of things that we're well known for, green cities and so on. So that's really important. And green wouldn't be the only area I'd mention. I'd also mention equality of opportunity, things like that, as well as being very important in how we tackle the crisis.
100%. Now, let's talk about this trend towards economic nationalism for a minute or two. The way I see it, European leaders are looking inward. Yes, they've got a green agenda. It's not always backwards, but it is inwards, let's say. President Trump looks inwards. China seems so often to be decoupling from the West or looking to be an engine of itself with domestic consumption. Given all of that, do you feel let down or disconnected by politicians and the governments that you work with sometimes?
So, I mean, this is the 40-year career. It's been through various ups and downs in terms of how I feel about leadership. I think you're right, though, Ryan. Right now, we're going through a sort of inward-looking period. I think it was there actually even before the crisis. I think the crisis maybe has exacerbated some of the tendencies. I think the trade disputes and discussions between US and China have taken up a lot of bandwidth for those two countries. And I think within the EU, this whole concept of strategic autonomy, that seems to be the new buzz phrase there. I do worry that that's making, again, European leaders who had actually, until recently, been very much reaching out to the wider world. I think, again, I worry that makes, some of what I said more difficult to achieve. I hope I'm not whistling in the wind when I say we need a new financing for development approach. But it will require new leaders, I think, to come to the fore. I think President Macron has made some good comments about the need for a multilateral push. I think people like Jacinda Ardern clearly has been very successful in tackling the COVID crisis. So I think there are leaders who could make this push, and we need them to come much more to the fore going forward. And within countries, I think it's up to EBRD and others to challenge the protectionist mantra, to challenge the sort of return to old ideas which didn't work out before, and also to challenge ideas which are sort of beggar thy neighbor ideas. And so that is something I think we must do as an institution. It goes to the heart of our mandate, after all.
Mm-hmm. Have we got any new arguments on that front, where I see a little bit of a replay of the 2008 financial crisis? And whereas maybe I'm projecting, at the time I was a bit younger, I hadn't been through a huge global crisis like that before, and it felt invigorating to have this battle between those who wanted to be globalist and outward looking and those who wanted to be inward looking. And this time round, I feel like sometimes it's the same old faces using the same old arguments, with maybe a bit of green thrown in to make it new and interesting. But are there new arguments we can say to people who feel let down by globalization or left out of the process?
Yeah, I think my worry is actually that some of those people who may feel let down by globalization, locked out of a good economic future, actually their fortunes going forward are much more negatively affected by the COVID crisis than others. I'll give you an example. The adage of last in, first out in terms of labor market. So the gains that have been made in recent years on, women in the labor force, women's access to finance, young people, because we were all worried about youth unemployment. Enormous efforts have been made in many countries, and also underdeveloped regions, if you like, the inclusion agenda writ large. There is a risk, I think, that in a crisis like the COVID one, which has economic recession as well looming, that many of these groups will actually, again, be put at the back of the queue.
Mhm.
It is absolutely important, I think, that not just EBRD, but leaders within countries speak up for them. I think actually this is going to happen anyway, because many of them are young people who will no longer accept actually that their futures are going to be negatively impacted for a generation. And as I certainly notice in many of the countries in Central Asia, North Africa, and others, Western Balkans, people speaking up much more as part of a democratization process that is going on. Yes, it's choppy in many of those countries, that process, but it is going on. And I think leaders can't ignore it. It just builds up more social and political problems for them if they do ignore that. So I think there is some hope here. And that's why I place a lot of emphasis on equality of opportunity as
Mhm.
along with green as being a really big theme. And the other area I would highlight is, that some things are happening at a more accelerated rate. We don't know quite how it's going to work out. So here we are having this conversation. You're in New York. I'm in Oxford. The future of work has arrived. Arrived earlier than we thought it was going to arrive. And so technology and digital technology in particular becomes a really big theme. Now, what does that mean? Because in the past, people worried about, and they have, since the Industrial Revolution, worried about how technology was going to actually make people poorer, particularly, or the returns would only go to certain people. That has not proved to be the case. But there's again that concern. So how do we make sure technology actually enables better economic futures for people of the world, people in developing countries, emerging markets? I think that's going to be fundamental as well. I highlight those three areas: green, equality of opportunity, technology. They're actually going to be the three main themes of EBRD's next 5-year strategy, which will be approved in the autumn. And I think it's not a surprise in a way, because they are responding to what was there before the crisis, but the crisis, I think, has made those three themes even starker and more important going forward.
I think you're right. If we talk about something like multilateralism or social progress, it's not a single thing you can stab to death
Yeah.
or get rid of. Some of it might be unwound and some people might face difficulty, but there's this kind of very thick knot of roots that keeps something like that in place, at least for a bit longer, I would hope. Thinking a bit about the role of development banks in that multilateral system, what role can you play to keep the system afloat? And is this now a chance where EBRD can work with other regional and global institutions to kind of be more efficient than whatever was going on previously?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. There have been so many studies over the last few years about how, in a nutshell, how the system becomes more than the sum of its parts, really. And the G20 did this Eminent Persons Group piece of work on this. There's been the Wise Persons Group in Europe as well. And it requires a big shift, and not just by the leadership and managements of these institutions like EBRD, but of our shareholders. They have to start thinking of the system as a system, not as individual entities. They have to start recognizing that each of the institutions have different skill sets, different expertise. The reason why I can talk about private sector in these countries isn't just because EBRD focuses on the private sector, but because we have 50 officers on the ground, not just in capital cities, but also in the provincial cities, collecting information, that market intelligence, what's happening at the SME level, what's happening at various levels. So we have a specific set of expertise, which is really useful in the international system. But that isn't to me to say that World Bank, African Development Bank, others, that we partner, they have their own specific roles as well, which we shouldn't try and duplicate. We should actually try and mesh together. That meshing together hasn't yet happened. And it's not just a technical thing. It's actually a leadership issue, I think, whereby the shareholders need to think together collectively about the different skill sets and expertise and financing modalities of these different institutions. Again, I think financing for development, ADIS 2, if you like, would be a very useful way to try and do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage that. But this time,
telemetry system, and you can see even in this, there's quite a lot of room for payload. Now with the jet, they fly 200 plus miles per hour. can fly autonomously, which means there's no radio frequency to detect by an RF sensor. And this model in particular, well, not this model, but jets in particular, the way the fuel reservoir is located with the turbine engine, which heats up to about 900 degrees Celsius, you don't need any explosive on board. When this flies into a target and the turbine engine goes into the fuel reservoir, there is an explosion and there's a flash fire, and it causes quite a bit of damage. So the impact on some of our counter UAS systems has been somewhat extreme. When you see the number of players in the industry, in the UAS industry, that are contributing to the innovation, that gap that already exists between counter UAS, which is typically responsive to the technologies that are demonstrated, increases even more because they're continually responding to a larger number of players with improved payloads, better cameras, better capabilities for the pilot, easier to fly. One of the reasons I mentioned that we weren't going to just focus in the Middle East and talk about threats all over the world is that these technologies are so easy to use now that anything being demonstrated in another country can easily migrate at the speed of the internet to any country around the world. Internet chat forums and YouTube videos and such bring all of these capabilities to even a novice pilot. You no longer have to be a real experienced pilot or someone who's been in the hobbyist community for quite a number of years. Jets might be the exception. They're a little bit harder to fly. They require a very clean environment and more technologically advanced. But all of the other things that I have showed you so far can be done by even a novice or someone with just a moderate level of capability. The impact on radio frequency sensors, which are a very major component of our counter UAS systems now, is that when I mentioned the frequency hop spread spectrum, it is very difficult for our RF sensors to scan the spectrum of a particular channel and capture an aircraft that is using frequency hop, because the frequency hopping is so good, it hops faster than the sensor can scan through the channel. So when it thinks it has found an aircraft, by the time it scans back around and tries to focus on that portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that it's operating, it has already bounced off. And it's doing this very, very quickly. Also, with the use of that Armilic system that I showed you earlier, our counter drone systems scan within those ISM bands. But as soon as we go outside of those ISM bands as a pilot, those could be areas of the spectrum that are not scanned, and therefore they're not going to see the aircraft. Also, autopilot systems. So when an autopilot system is used, it's what we call RF dark. There's no radio frequency broadcast between the ground controller and the aircraft itself. Therefore, there's nothing to sense by that radio frequency sensor on the counter drone system. We'll talk a little bit about radars. So radars are have quite a number of issues, even though they're quite beneficial and they are an important component of a counter UAS suite. Radars come on many different bands, your L bands and S bands. They can look a little bit further. However, they cannot detect items which have a very small radar cross section. Many of the drones that we fly have a radar cross section, or it's a radar reflection that is about equal to a biologic, like a bird. So when you're looking through a lot of space for a drone that's coming from a long distance, you're picking up a lot of noise, a lot of other things that are potentially aircraft. Think about doing this months on months without it being a UAS, and eventually you become fairly numb to looking at birds constantly and deselecting them from the radar. One of the radar systems that has come online that can detect a smaller radar cross section is the X-band radar. However, because of the trade-off though it picks up the smaller cross section, it also has a much shorter distance that it can look out. Also, radars work on line of sight. An aircraft that flies low, whether it's behind a tree or some other structure, isn't going to be seen by the radar, and that is the typical flight protocol of someone who's doing an attack, is keeping the aircraft fairly low. And additionally, the aircraft like the multi-rotors, when they're flying about 5 knots or less or come to a hover, the radar actually loses their cross section because it's relying on kind of that Doppler pulse to respond. And it's not the pulse coming off of the aircraft itself, but the movement from the first pulse to the second to the third. And when it moves very slow, the radar loses the aircraft. We often rely on electro-optical infrared cameras. Once the radar or an RF sensor has picked up an anomaly on the horizon, we use a camera to slew to where that item was sensed, and we zoom into it and to determine whether it is a UAS or not. When you think of situations where there are multiple aircraft in the air, a camera can only track one at any one time. Therefore, if I were going to be a bad guy and launch an attack, I'd make the largest, the most obvious aircraft that can be easily tracked, one that the camera is going to key on as I follow in with a very low, a faster aircraft, one that's not tracked as easily, and it's one that may not be detected as it's approaching the target area. So I just kind of want to say that as a disclaimer, nearly all counter UAS systems are effective to some degree, but they're effective in the operational environment that it was meant to operate in. And so when selecting counter UAS systems, we have to look at a suite of technologies, not just an RF sensor, not just a radar or a camera, but all of them operating and integrated together. However, even though when they're being operated that way, they are still, I would say, the drone still has the upper hand, right? There are many ways of countering a counter drone system or avoiding the sensor, and those improved technologies that I've talked about are ways that are rendering our counter drone systems a little less effective than we would want them to be. For the sake of time, I'm going to cut my my presentation here and open it up for questions if you want to know a little bit more about counter drone systems, some ways that we can decrease our risk to UAS attacks, and maybe answer some of your questions on critical infrastructure in particular. So yeah, thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you, Dr. Carino, really useful. And we will open up to Q&A in just a few minutes. For the moment, to take this to the policy level, to take this discussion up one more strata, we have the pleasure to be joined by the Honorable Mary Beth Long, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and former chair of NATO's high-level group. Mary Beth is an expert also on export compliance, which is a critical topic to the UAS and counter-UAS communities globally. And she's involved in discussions about the use and countering of drones at the policy level, both in the US and with our partners abroad. So Ms. Long, may I please pass the mic to you?
Thanks, Kristen, and thank all of you for participating. I want to take just a moment and join with the ambassador of wishing everyone well in the coronas, but also to express Eid Mubarak to all of our Muslim friends and those living in the Middle East. May the Lord and the health mavens who are out there keep all of you and your families and loved ones safe. Listen, I thought I would take really just a moment to do a quick outline. I really have 3 parts to what I hope to be a very quick sort of summary of where we are and where the discussions that I've been having, either as truth and disclosure, I'm an advisor to Red 6, but I'm also involved in Middle East private discussions, Track 2 discussions that had me into both Doha, Cairo, and other places as part of the Munich Security Conference that were focused on the Middle East. And there was quite a bit of discussion about drone. And just as a recap, and I know most of you know this, but really drones have been used, at least by militaries, since World War II. What has changed over the years is we've moved from using drones primarily for what we would consider ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to a more recent use of using drones to target particular targets of interest, whether they were individuals or military targets, to really using drones more ubiquitously in warfare. There's been a huge change in the drone usage, particularly in warfare in the last decade. And we can see that in the way the drones were used first in Syria and most recently in Libya, where many analysts will argue that the traditional desire to control airspace, which is normally dominated by airplanes and modern technology, is controlled in this circumstance by drones, or was, and with significant impacts on the way that the battle changed from one side to the other. I have what I call the 10 challenges of modern drone usage that I just want to quickly go over with you, lay them out very briefly for you, and then go to what I understand to be the military and the US government's really 5 major points of going forward with drones as we look into the future. Is everybody hearing me okay? All right, just making sure. First, of course, is the proliferation of drones, normally from a state use, from state apparatus for one, that are now available to non-state actors, and now we're proliferating even down to the individual basis. And that's not all a bad thing. Drones are being used even by the US military for firefighting, for flooding control, for weather. I know the Israelis use them a fair amount to monitor the amount of water that goes through their agricultural organizations and their specific areas. They're being used for construction site surveys. They're being used for all kinds of very important uses in the civilian world that will lead to more efficiencies and to savings, which means that we're going to be dealing with drones in a much more proliferated, much more broad way in the next couple of years. Drones are the low-cost way of saving, to doing their surveillance, mapping, intelligence gathering, monitoring of critical infrastructure, both maritime, in the air, and on the ground. So again, more use of drones in the future. It's also a very low-cost way of creating havoc. And here's where we get into some of the dangers of drones, particularly when you put them in individual hands. I know the Chief of Security for Live Nation is absolutely terrified that a drone, and maybe even a drone that doesn't have any kind of weaponization or dangerous per se, can be used to wreak havoc on large crowds that could result in serious damage as people riot, as traffic jams start to develop, as VIPs are then targeted, and even loss of lives as first responders are not able to get access to events where a drone has either dropped a smoke bomb, saying that it's a biochemical or other kind of weapon causing panics, or huge problems with drone uses near airports where a person could call in and say, I have a biochemical weapon, or I have a drone with a bomb on it. I'm flying it over your airport now, forcing the airport to shut down, forcing flights to be canceled, forcing panic in the airports. The implications and the indirect and direct application of drones to wreak havoc are something that we have not dealt with as a society, and is going to become more difficult to deal with as, again, drones proliferate, particularly in the commercial sector. Drones are very difficult to detect. From a military standpoint, low and slow was never something that, from a missile defense perspective, the US was particularly interested. Fast and lethal was the name of the game, but now with the proliferation of drones that are weaponized or weaponizable, we have to totally re-examine the way that we are securing our facilities, VIPs, and other military and critical infrastructure in order to deal with a very small object, which sometimes can be low, much lower than the trajectories that we're used to identifying, and much slower than we're used to identifying. On the flip side, you have the emergence of basically jet technology, where a drone can be delivered at over 100 and probably even approaching 200 miles an hour. I don't want to press Scott, but I know how fast his guys can go, which is also going to complicate not only detecting, but then intercepting a drone in a manner in which is safe and secure, but doesn't again cause uh, interruption to commercial and other activities that then complicate the fact that drones can really be used for not only delivering lethal or disruptive technology, but also can create havoc and panic among our citizenry. Drones are accessible to anyone. Civilians will become increasingly using drones to do things like some of what I just mentioned. The mining industry actually is using drones now, city planning and construction, in order to go take a look at the way bridges are being built, whether it's soldering has deteriorated over time. There will be a big push, and there is a big push in the US to actually facilitate even the delivery of goods. I'm sure you've all heard, through drones, which will mean sharing of airspace, rules and regulations and policies are going to be particularly difficult because why? Number 9 on my list, cross jurisdictional line. Who gets to decide the use of airspace? Traditionally, the FAA designates various altitudes as well as manner of drones in the United States for regulating the use of them, whether you need a license and how you can use the drone. But will that apply across the board? What happens for a first responder to a critical infrastructure attack, for example? Is that an FAA consideration? Is it a police consideration? Is it a first responder consideration? We have jurisdictional issues already in the US, which will be getting actually even more complicated as drone usage becomes more complicated on who gets to make the rules. Already there are a number of courts that have litigated these issues, whereas a drone user had one set of rules and regulations for local use of drones that were contradicted by federal use of drones. And which one of those applies and which one of those will you be held accountable to? And then finally, there's keeping up with drone technology. One of the utilities of an organization like Red 6 and others like it are that the drone use and technology utilization, whether it's adaptation of commercial or homegrown drone use, is moving so rapidly that the library, the database of information of the technical aspects of drone are extremely difficult to keep up with, not only for the military, but for people that have to deal with drones on a day-by-day basis. So there's a lot to be dealt with there. From a military perspective and from an overseas perspective, I'll pause for just one moment because I know that there are many organizations that are participating in this phone call that are interested in how we work together, particularly from a military perspective or from a VIP security or critical infrastructure perspective on countering drones. Well, the first actual thing to consider as far as the DoD is concerned, the Undersecretary Ellen Lord, the Secretary of Acquisition and Sustainment, is responsible, sort of the focus point as far as policy making in the Department of Defense. Although the Army has been designated the executive agency for drones writ large across the DoD, that doesn't mean there's going to be one-stop shopping. So one of the things that will happen in the near term is difficulty navigating DARPA, DITSA, and the other organizations within the department that are responsible for drone regulations and policies. The second is the obvious. From an overseas perspective, what are the direct impact or the direct threats that drones present to DoD forces? And those are everything from kinetic impact, direct impacts, to payloads, nanotechnology, whether there'll be a bio or chemical weapon on a drone, whether the drone can be attributed to a certain target. One of the big issues with the attack in the kingdom was where exactly did the drones come from, and how do you hold a party accountable where it's very difficult to attribute the drone once it has done its duty to a particular nation state, individual within that country. It's not very different from the difficulties of attributing an accountability with cyber. A lot of the same problems there. The second is the one I want to flag for our foreign listeners, and that is the indirect problems that DoD is looking at when it comes to the implication of drone usage by our host nation countries, those with whom we interoperate, and those who we sell weapons to, or with whom we integrate, either by integrating a system of F-16 or other US provided equipment with your indigenous or legacy drone systems and drone networks. For example, one of the things Ellen Lohr's office is talking about is whether at some point there will be a zero tolerance issue with Chinese drones, not just those for JAI or DJI, I apologize, but other prohibitions with linking US provided military technology that are already in the systems of our foreign partners with a Chinese drone system or network that can either be used to directly target US forces or US capabilities, or indirectly by collecting information, storing it, and sending it back to China or other adversaries in order to develop counter adversary or counter technology that will either prohibit, inhibit, or have applications against our technologies, particularly those in the aerospace realm. I know, for example, there's some discussion about whether or not drone swarms that we hope to use with a lot of our allies can be linked up to Chinese technology or even Huawei as we go forward, and whether there'll be restrictions then even on exports of US technology into countries that will make the export part of a system that includes drone technology that the US considers a direct or indirect threat. I'll stop there. I know that's a lot to sort of throw out there. I have just a very small period of time, but I thought I would throw out enough information to get those of you thinking about the implications, not only for integrating technologies with DoD, talking with DoD, but the indirect application of non-DoD or non-US drone technology in systems that are linked with US equipment as possible future problems. Particularly, we haven't even discussed it when you couple drone technology with artificial intelligence. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you so much. And I want to pick up on that last point you just made to ask both you and Scott if you could talk a bit about, with your experience in advising both the US and partner nation and allies, what do you all think they're doing wrong based on simply a lack of the kind of information you both have just shared? Are there, Scott, at the end of your presentation, you hinted that there are things that can be done. If you were the decision makers sitting in the capitals of our foreign partners, what kinds of things would you be doing?
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. And that's a great question. Mainly, we look at every different location as a separate independent operating environment. And so there is no single counter drone system that you would put everywhere, because that doesn't exist. Even in our own country, we do a lot of work with the TSA looking at the airports, large pieces of critical infrastructure. Miami Airport is different from Dallas, which is different from Denver, which is different from many other locations around the country, and they need to be treated differently. So it really starts with a site assessment. Look at what you have in that area, what the threats are in that area, and piece together a suite of technologies that operate in an integrated manner to a single common operating system that is customized specifically for that operating environment. So whether you have an onshore oil production facility or an offshore facility, or you have large urban areas, each one of those is going to need something that's bespoke to its location.
If I could just add, Kristen, and I apologize, I have terrible allergies today, so I don't mean to cough. There's really three things when I speak to my interlocutors that I think are important to highlight, and that is There is no one drone system that is going to bring you the answer that you need. What you need to have is a system of systems. It's got to be integrated into your security, not only at the military level, but a lot of what we're talking about are either police or law enforcement type issues, first responder issues, humanitarian issues. It's got to be a system of systems. And that means that buying a product that is the latest and greatest is a start, but it's certainly not the most important decision you can make. The most important decision you can make is to have a system that is adaptable, that can move as quickly and shift as quickly as the threat itself and as the technology changes. Thirdly, it's not just the system and the equipment that you have, but its users. It's having a clearly defined goal for your systems. It's having training. It's having exercises that allow you to adapt and to show that the way that drones are used are actually the way that you hope that they perform. But it's also taking a hard look then at the real threat that your drone themselves or your drone system of systems will be targeted, not just by the Chinese or the Iranians or other adversaries, but by hackers. And you need to make sure that you're resilient. You need to make sure that you're on top of possible attempts to attack or to subvert or to kidnap your drone and turn it against other users. So you need to be adaptable, flexible, move with time, and to practice with drone policies and training that will deliver the goals that you're seeking.
Thank you both very much. Let's turn now to the US side. In looking at things like legislation, what do you recommend that Congress do to ensure that actors who are already on site at airports or other points of critical infrastructure are empowered to be both the first responders and to take the necessary actions that they need to when faced with the UAS threat? And then secondarily, legislation is always kind of behind the security threat. So what about tasking industry to be self-regulating or accountable? These are some questions we're getting from the audience. If you could touch on those.
I think it's very difficult for industry to be self-regulating, particularly given the truly explosive opportunities that drones of all sorts are going to provide. And Scott would know more about that particular aspect than I did. I also don't think legislation, particularly federal legislation, is particularly the way to go. I think the federal legislation needs to set standards, particularly when it comes to safety issues that are relevant to things like air transportation and maritime transportation, use against critical infrastructure. But then you have to have policies, and those are going to have to come, I think, as a practical matter from local jurisdictions, whether it's state or the immediate jurisdiction on the ground. There we're going to have to guard against inconsistencies and have some kind of guidelines that give a right and a left rudder, so you don't have a drone operator, for example, like a Wayfair or an Amazon, that is dealing with 50 different rules in 50 different jurisdictions. More importantly, from a first responder perspective, we need to set some policy about who is responsible at the end of the day. Is it the first responder, which traditionally is not part of a criminal, investigative, or other authority, or a state security apparatus? These are, in many jurisdictions, volunteers who are there solely to provide assistance. They basically don't respond to any of the above. So we need to come up with local policies and best practices that then guide legislation. Nothing's worse than having a bunch of guys in Washington set out frameworks other than the national frameworks that we all have to fall within. But I'll defer to Scott. He's actually dealt quite a bit of this with the FAA in some of our busiest airports, as I understand it.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Beth. So let me start with an example actually from overseas, and I will then kind of tie that back into domestic stuff. In China, there's something called the Stir Fry Syndicate, right? And it's a group of Chinese gangsters that are flying over pig farms, and dropping tainted pork. Well, pigs will eat anything, and so they're eating this tainted pork, and a tainted pork has a swine flu in it. So after pigs have eaten it, the gangsters are approaching the farmers, and they're saying, we are going to spread that you have swine flu and no one's going to buy from you. So give us all of your pigs. And then they take them across provincial lines where it's supposedly a clean area, and they sell them for a much higher price. Pork prices in China are already very inflated. Well, the response to that by the farmer was to put in his own radio frequency jammer. When the aircraft would fly over his farm, he would jam the aircraft. It would essentially cause it to return to its launch point and geofence to kind of keep it out of his area. The result of all of that was the farmer being fined for employing an unauthorized radio frequency jammer on his land, right? So we have a very similar policy structure here in the United States, in that right now, all of our policy regulations are on the side of the pilot and not so much on the side of the user of a counter drone system. In particular, Chapter 18 of the US Code guards against a lot of removal of civil liberties in terms of UAS. So I have them listed here: sections 32, 1030, 1362, 1367, 2511. Essentially, they guard against destruction of aircraft, unauthorized access of a computer system, which an aircraft is considered, interference with government and satellite communications, which would be that GPS link for the aircraft, and also the interception of personal communications. They don't have to be oral, it could be the cyber communications as well. Now, the government doesn't want to release those authorities because there are a lot of considerations here. And yes, we want to keep drones out of areas that they shouldn't be in. However, we're talking about integrating aircraft into our national airspace for industry and for commerce. And one of the ways we're going to support that is integrate a remote ID capability, which means aircraft that are authorized are pushing a particular transponder code, something that when interrogated, the person on the ground knows that that is an authorized commercial aircraft or an industrial aircraft, and not one that's being used for nefarious use or just someone we call the careless and clueless, flying where they shouldn't be and putting themselves or people or infrastructure at risk. Until that is integrated into our national airspace, we're not just going to let anyone jam aircraft, deny GPS, which is so many technologies rely on it for precision navigation and timing. And also there's the collateral damage of just jamming a communications band on 2.4 or 5.8, which cell phones and other devices use quite commonly. All that aside, there is something called the Prevention of Emerging Threats Act of 2018. And this is Congress trying to get the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security some authority to mitigate aircraft at what they considered covered assets. A covered asset would be something of a high value target. Not us to determine, and it can't be self-determined what a high value target is, but they are going through that process of identifying covered assets and determining who is allowed to use a counter drone mitigation system at those locations. But we're talking a few, not dozens or hundreds. And so still it puts the drone operator with more legal authorities than the counter drone operator has right now. And so this whole thing, it's moving incredibly slow. It is required because there are a lot of considerations. And then all that being said, not knowing the international airspace as well, those same considerations may be in other countries as well, not just the Middle East or North Africa. But before we just take our counter drone systems and we start jamming broadly across multiple bands or denying GPS, we need to think about the ramifications of that.
Great, Scott. Thank you. Thank you both very much. And, dovetailing onto that, can you talk to us about how you all assess DoD's efforts to counter armed drones and protection of installations? We have questions coming in about that. Or, SHORAD and maneuver forces. Are we exercising regularly against these kinds of threats? Scott, I know you're personally involved in a lot of those exercises. Can you speak to the extent to which that's happening and the extent to which you think the exercises are reflecting the current threat?
Yeah, absolutely we can. And so this is something that our company does quite regularly. And we are threat emulators, which means we try to fly both the aircraft and the flight protocols that threats are flying, not just those that are being demonstrated domestically and overseas, but trying to integrate technologies that haven't been demonstrated yet. The assumption being, if we can do it with our pilots, some other bad actor is going to be using those same technologies and integrating them the same way that we are. So we're trying to get ahead of that curve a little bit. The problem is this: no one wants to put money against or write a requirement for something that hasn't happened yet. And so we're always playing catch up to what the threat is already doing and not what we think the threat is going to do. And in our training environments, even though we're flying drones, there is a level of emulation that you can do, and no one is getting all spun up when you drop Nerf balls on the target, because they don't hear things blowing up. They don't understand how vulnerable they are and how exploitable the current counter drone systems are. Some of the purchases from years ago, there might be a little bit of buyer's remorse there. They haven't quite scaled the way the operations on the drone side have scaled. They haven't quite adapted. And so there's some that has to be considered when purchasing those systems, a technology refresh. So people who are using those systems aren't always happy with the way that they are operating and would like something else. My feeling, and this is just a little self-promotion, but we've flown against 200 plus counter drone systems out there. If you want to know which ones work, ask the pilots. If you go to the technology vendor and ask, do your systems work? Can it stop a drone when we are operating in this type of environment? 9 out of 10 times they're going to say, yes, they can. And then we find where those limitations are. And so you really need to bring in something of a middleman to look at, how are you operating? Where are you operating? And let's determine which counter drone systems are right for you, and not just buy what's the cheapest, buy what the hottest technology is today, because it may not be applicable in all environments. It's not a very good answer to your question. The military, they are doing things to integrate counter drone systems, but it will never seem like enough because the industry is moving faster than the counter drone systems are able to respond.
That's it,
Kristen.
Oh, sure, please, Meredith, absolutely.
Yeah, can I add something to that? And if I don't mean to be critical of anyone in particular, particularly not our Defense Department, because this